Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Derek Terrell. I'm the Director of Engagement here with the Coalition for College. And today you all are here for a very important session. As you all know, there have been many changes this year and for this upcoming cycle, one of those being one with the FAFSA. And we have our resident FAFSA expert here, Paul Martin from College Money Method, who's going to help you all kind of understand those changes. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul. But before I do, just so you all know, the Q&A is enabled. So if there are any questions that you have that come up throughout the presentation, feel free to drop those in the Q&A and we'll address those later. But Paul will likely cover a lot of the questions that were submitted with the registration. So hold tight for a bit, listen to the presentation, but if anything does come up, feel free to go ahead and drop it into the Q&A. And once again, this session is being recorded and will be distributed after the session. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Paul.
Thank you so much, Derek, and thanks for welcoming me to your community and to be able to speak about, again, I know this very important topic that seems to be changing day to day as we get more information. So, I've been really involved, gone to several conferences on this, and I want to be able to share that information with as many folks as possible. So that's kind of a synopsis of what I'm going to be talking about today are really the FAFSA changes, but more specifically, as counselors and college access professionals, how do we help advise families through these changes? I know families are really concerned, as you're hearing already. We have a delay in the FAFSA until sometime in December, still to be determined by Department of Education. So getting information as accurate as possible, but in front of families so they can be proactive and feel more confident in the process ahead is going to be really important. Just want to drop by and introduce myself a little bit further. So this is a picture of me when I was graduating high school about 30 years ago. These are my folks, and it was a proud moment because I was the first, and I ended up being the only one in my family to choose college as a path. And it was only because of financial aid and that process that opened up opportunities for me to be able to go directly to a four-year university. And I ended up getting my undergraduate at Harvard and later getting my master's at MIT. And going through that process as a first-gen student, I realized how challenging it could be, and especially when you might not have the guidance from parents who've been through it themselves. But even for parents who've been to college, this process is changing so much, and we really want to help support them in understanding that. I do a lot of volunteer work. I work with a local community-based organization called Path to College, where we focus on first-gen students' access to their four-year college dream. I'm also president of First Generation Alumni of MIT. That's an alumni group founded for those recognized as first in their family to graduate from MIT and wanting to create that community back, and including mentorship to current first-gen students at MIT. I'm a member of several professional associations. I also have the privilege of serving my home district, Miami-Dade County Public Schools, as a FAFSA advisor and trainer district-wide to their counselors. So we're starting, give you some idea. We know there's a new FAFSA for this cycle, and that FAFSA change will continue. It is the result of Congress legislation, as normally this would happen. What I want to emphasize is that there have actually been two legislations passed. The one that gets the most spoken about is the FAFSA simplification process or act, which enabled most of the eligibility changes. But the reason why we can have a somewhat simplified FAFSA was legislation passed a little earlier called the Future Act, which enabled process changes. And the biggest process change is a direct exchange of data between the IRS and the Department of Education. So the hope of all of this is to increase student applicants through a simplified process. We're going to talk about how simplification may apply for some students and families, but may not be as simplified for others. Increasing eligibility for federal student aid, I'll talk about some of those eligibility changes. And we have terminology changes. And one of the key terminology changes is that they have decided to sunset the term expected family contribution and replace that with student aid index, which, as I've been doing workshops and advising families, can be a confusing terminology because it has the word aid in the actual phrase. Some students and families interpret it as their aid eligibility. But in fact, student aid index is a replacement for expected family contribution. I typically tell families this is generally your calculated ability to pay for college or expectation of your ability to pay for college. Now, as I had mentioned, while there's been a lot of concentration on eligibility changes, which I will talk about, I really want to kick off with new application process changes, which again were enabled primarily because of that additional act of Congress. So 3 key areas of a process change is that the FAFSA will be roles-based going forward. There'll be separate student and parent paths and sections that they will exclusively have access to and complete in order to submit the FAFSA. They're considered contributors now to the FAFSA, both students and parents. There's the FSA-ID requirement now. We'll talk a little bit about that, but in order to access the online FAFSA, all contributors will have to generate their own FSA-ID. And finally, there is now a requirement that every contributor to the FAFSA has to consent for IRS data sharing. So let's get a little bit more in detail about what these process changes actually look like. So the first one, the FAFSA being roles-based, means that the student and parent have separate workflows. In other words, as a student logs into the FAFSA, now they will only see student sections of the FAFSA, questions related to particularly their participation and what what they need to enter. And parents likewise will log in and only see parent-related questions. And in an ideal world, a student would begin the application and invite the parents that need to participate on the FAFSA to complete their sections. So one of the disadvantages of this new format is there's no longer a single view of the application. If a student logs in, they're not going to see the entire application, nor will a parent when they log in, which was previously the case. And every time a student or parent logs in with their FSA-ID, it will require multi-factor verification. This is simply the fact that in order to complete login, they will have to actually receive a text message with a code or an email message with a code to complete login. So give you an idea of role-based, this is the screen that a student would see that asks them to enter information about their parent, to invite their parent or potentially additional parent, in this case, parent, spouse, or partner, to participate on the FAFSA. I'll talk a little bit more about this as we talk about the new rules for divorced parents. But you can see here, there's an expectation the student has key information, including the parent's social security number, in order for that invitation to be sent and the parent to receive notification. The parent will receive that notification. So as they log in with their FSA-ID, they will see that in this case, through the demo process that's been released by Federal Student Aid, Raya Tran, as the student has invited a parent to be a contributor to the FAFSA, and it asks that individual to accept that role. So as part of this, to try to facilitate collaboration between multiple contributors, the FAFSA now has a status center, which will allow either a student or parent to be able to log in and see the status of the application that the other contributor is, or that portion of the application the other contributor is supposed to be completing. So that can help, but as you might imagine, this is going to require much more coordination as we have multiple contributors that are exclusively responsible for their portions of the FAFSA. So some of the challenges, as I said, are parents are no longer going to control the process. We might have cases in the past where parents fill out almost all of the FAFSA and only involve the student for signature. Similarly, if we have first gen or other students who typically take a lead in the financial aid process, that may be also a challenge because those students will no longer be able to complete the FAFSA and involve their parents purely for the purposes of electronic signature and submission. Another component is that once the FAFSA is started by the student, it must be completed in 45 days or the application will expire. And that means the student would have to start again, and really thinking through about how we're going to support students and parents to ensure follow through, that the FAFSA, all contributors have completed their sections, that it can be considered complete and processed for federal and institutional aid. FSA-ID now is going to be required by every contributor. And part of the reason for this is the need to consent for IRS data sharing. So in order to do that online, a contributor has to have an identity verified FSA-ID. Now, it is still the case that any student applying for federal student aid must have a social security number. And that is how a student would continue to create their FSA-ID. They're going to use their social security number, and the IRS will use that social security number. It will be shared with the IRS to identity verify that ID. It usually takes 2 to 3 days. So we want students and parents for that matter, who have social security numbers, to be going through that process earlier so that they have those IDs ready to be able to log on and complete the FAFSA. However, in this cycle, because the Department of Education is trying to make FAFSA completely online electronic, there is also an option for contributors. This would be potentially parents for dependent students to still create an FSA ID, even though they may not have a social security number. So if there's no social security number, those contributors would go through a third party. It's proposed to be TransUnion right now, that uses a knowledge-based identity process to identify that contributor. So we might think about this similarly if we have, as adults, filled out applications for loans or other kind of financial institutions. They may ask things like, what address did you live in the past 4 years? So ways that you can show that you can identify yourself based off of facts about your life in the past. So that is going to be a new requirement. And in order to even log into the FAFSA now, you will be required to have an FSA ID to complete your section. So this can be a critical part of the FAFSA completion process for dependent students and the contributors, which will typically be those students' parents. Now, some of the challenges we might anticipate, and one that currently exists, is for those contributors that don't have a social security number and want to create their FSA ID, that process is still not available. It was proposed to be available in September. It may be available in October, but we still don't have a definitive date when the Department of Education will release that process that a family can, or a non-social security number holder contributor can actually create their FSA ID. We might imagine there can be undocumented parents or parents without identity, particularly social security identity, that will not be comfortable in completing this additional type of government ID. So we have to think about how we might support the students whose parents might be undocumented but may not want to participate. Certainly, if we have parents that live outside the US but are supposed to be participating, contributing to the FAFSA, could be a similar challenge without having a social security number. And ultimately, there will be the ability for students and their contributors or parents, if those parents have decided not to create a FSA ID, to submit a paper FAFSA. So we want to think about what that will look like, because that will still be an option. It will be an option that will take more time for processing, just as it does today. But that is a possibility in these cases. So we have to be familiar with the paper FAFSA and that process around submitting that FAFSA. So again, the third process change, the key process change, I should say, is the requirement for every contributor to consent that the IRS share federal tax information directly with the Department of Education. And I do want to emphasize that this is a legislative requirement, meaning that that consent is part of the application process, regardless of a contributor's tax filing status. So if a contributor, in many cases our students, don't file taxes, they still have to agree to consent for that share, even though there's no tax form to be transferred. And this would be true for any contributor, including parents who may not file taxes. Because without consent, it has been stated that the FAFSA will not be processed. It doesn't matter that there's not data to be shared. It's really about providing that consent as a requirement for FAFSA processing and receipt of federal student aid. Now, the potential positive of this, if of course contributors, particularly parents, have filed their income taxes, is that all information will come directly from 2022 tax returns. So this is part of that simplification, the hardest simplification, where information won't have to be independently entered. And for all tax filers, if there's a tax form on file, there won't be an option for manual entry. But it is the case, as I mentioned, that the information that's transferred from 2022 taxes will not be displayed on the FAFSA nor the FAFSA submission summary. So that may be a bit of a challenge for some families. In the case that no tax return is found, so remember, every contributor has to consent to share data, but there might not be data or a tax return to share, then there will be an option to go into manual entry for income and taxes. So here are some possible scenarios where a contributor, again, student or parent would have to manually enter their information. And that could be the case in many of these cases here. So this is a screenshot from the walkthrough of the FAFSA that shows essentially the requirement to provide consent or be eligible for federal student aid. And as I've been to multiple conferences on this summer, federal student aid representatives have said that if consent isn't initially provided, there will be a couple speed bumps along the way to really encourage that contributor to consent for data sharing because of the ramifications of not being eligible for federal student aid. So some of the challenges we might see around this new requirement for consent are when a parent or student does not consent. For whatever reason, they might not feel comfortable in that consent, and therefore that makes that student in FAFSA null and void. The parent and student can complete the FAFSA and submit it, but the FAFSA will not be processed because one or more contributors has not provided consent. Helping families and students understand that consent doesn't mean that you filed your taxes. So, and there's going to be a lot of confusion because I would understandably agree that if I didn't file taxes, why would I consent for sharing from the IRS if there's nothing to be found? But that consent is independent of tax filing status. Contributors, again, won't be able to validate the federal tax information shared. And, late tax filing for families that or parents that typically will file taxes may result in an unprocessed FAFSA until those taxes are filed and transferred from the IRS. So when we're thinking about advising families on these new processes, really bringing early awareness and understanding to some of these key new requirements, particularly those ones that may make families uncomfortable because they're newer and they're a process of asking for sharing information with the government, whether it's FSA creation or transfer of information from the IRS. Those can be critical. Guidance on early FSA creation, understanding, unfortunately, we still don't have a process for contributors that don't have a social security number. But at the same time, when we can encourage as many families as possible to create their FSA early, we plan FAFSA completion events, which will most likely be in January, given the late FAFSA release. What does that mean to invite both students and parents? Because, and the FAFSA completion events I've been over the last several years, we can have one person log in and take the lead to complete the entire FAFSA in that event and only need that additional contributor for electronic signature. Now they're going to have two different logins, two different paths, and need to coordinate that. And of course, even as we are in October already for 2022 tax filing, encouraging that filing as early as possible if it hasn't happened, so that those taxes are available when that FAFSA is released sometime at the end of December. So when we're talking about dependency status, that has not changed. So this determines whether a student's independent or dependent. And the basic requirements for a student to be considered independent still remain the same. In other words, students will answer these key questions on the FAFSA or potentially check one of these. And if they check none of the above apply to me, they will normally automatically be considered dependent and will be required to include their parent, at least one parent on the FAFSA to complete that. So generally speaking, you can see here, I typically say if a student hasn't served in the military, if that student is not married or doesn't have their own dependents, if that student isn't a ward of the court or in foster care or in legal guardianship under a court order, then that student is under 24, that student will be considered dependent regardless of their living status with their parents. Now, one of the changes is that there is an opportunity for students to elect into unusual circumstances that can change their dependency status. And so we have two types of circumstances. We have unusual circumstances, which if that student does have these unusual circumstances, can change their dependency status from dependent to independent, whereas special circumstances still exist. And this means that there's been a change in financial situation. Essentially that the data on the FAFSA, let's say the 2022 income, is no longer reflective of income for the family because income has changed. And special circumstances will always go through the financial aid office directly, submitting that financial information for reconsideration of eligibility. But for unusual circumstances, there is an option now for students to choose, and there's going to be a screen for them to choose whether they identify on having an unusual circumstance. And this will allow them to complete the FAFSA as what's called a provisional independent student. Essentially meaning that as any independent applicant, they would not have to involve their parent to submit the FAFSA and receive estimated federal aid. Now, it is important to know that this is a provisional independence as well as provisional student aid index and federal aid eligibility. And it will ultimately end up at the financial aid administrator at the specific college to request documentation substantiating these unusual circumstances in order to make that provisional independent student a fully independent student and be fully processed for the FAFSA. So this is a screenshot. You can see the typical circumstances in which a student would be at risk by contacting their parents. And if the student does answer yes to any of these questions, they will be able to complete the FAFSA as an provisionally independent student and not involve their parents. But as I've said in a couple of workshops I've done at schools for counselors, we want to make sure that students understand the full process and the fact that, although we might not be talking to our parents for the week because, things happen in the family, that doesn't put them in unusual circumstances. So it really is important to help them understand what an unusual circumstance would be and what the follow-on process will be in terms of validating with your financial aid administrator at the college that's receiving the FAFSA. I want to also talk about changes for students who have divorced or separated parents. So there is a new definition of custodial parent. Well, first thing I want to emphasize, and I think, given that there is a change, a lot of families are starting to think that now both parents have to be involved in the FAFSA, and that is still no longer true. When we're talking about the FAFSA, the student would choose one biological or adoptive parent in the case that those parents are divorced and separated, not living together, to participate on the FAFSA. But who they choose has changed, and that's where the definition has changed. So as I say in workshops I do at schools all the time, it has nothing to do with the parent who claimed the student on their taxes or who might have legal custody by court definition. The definition of a custodial parent also doesn't involve where the student lives any longer. That used to be the case. It's now the parent who provides greater support financially or student financial support for the 12 months prior to application submission. So a student would look back if they're applying for FAFSA in January and effectively look at 2023 to determine which parent provided greater financial support. In the case it's 50-50, the FAFSA will ask the student to invite the parent with a higher income. Now, it is still true that if that custodial parent, the divorced parent, is remarried, they must include the spouse on the FAFSA. So how is the FAFSA trying to facilitate this? When a student logs in, they're going to have this, what they're deeming to be called the parent wizard, which will ask them a series of questions to help them determine who to invite on the FAFSA. The primary one is if the parents are married to each other. They're married to each other, then they have to invite just one parent in the case that the parents file taxes jointly as married filing jointly. However, if the parents aren't married to each other but still live together, that is a scenario, according to federal student aid, where both parents are still participating because they live in the same household. But if they don't live together, then there we have the question, did one parent provide greater financial support? In the case of yes, then finally it'll ask if that parent who provided greater financial support is remarried. And if the case that they're remarried, then that spouse would need to participate on the FAFSA. So here's the screen. After we go through that wizard, the student will have a screen. We saw this a little earlier, where they're going to invite their parents, potentially the parent, spouse, or partner, to participate on the FAFSA. Now, if the student answered that the parents are married, then they're going to have this screen be parent 1 and parent 2. They can invite both parents to the FAFSA. And who creates an FSA-ID is an important component of this. If the parents in a married situation filed taxes jointly as married filing jointly, then only one parent has to create an FSA-ID because they can provide consent for the IRS to share that joint tax return. But in the case that we have married parents that do not file jointly, then in fact, each parent does have to create an FSA ID because they have to provide separate permission for the IRS to return those individual tax returns. And in the case that a divorced parent is remarried to a new spouse or partner, if that parent has to involve the spouse, the new spouse has to create FSAD, would follow similar rules as to how they file their taxes. So some of the challenges we're going to potentially face is helping students determine custodial parent. Given the new rules, I know there are going to be a lot of questions about that. What I can assure our counseling community is, as I've attended, for example, NCAN had the Better FAFSA conference with federal student aid, that there's not going to be guidance by federal student aid to financial aid officers or administrators on what constitutes financial support. So it is solely up to the student and their parents to determine what financial support is and which parent provides the greater financial support. So you can guide your students to help them know that they get to determine the greater what constitutes financial support and measure that to which parent should participate on the FAFSA in the case of separation or divorce. We want to ensure all contributors participate. So there are certain rules, particularly when married parents or a married parent and a new spouse don't file together. There have to be multiple FSAIDs created. And there can be a change if a student has already applied for aid in earlier years and is reapplying. They are in a family that's separated or divorced. There might be a different custodial parent participating on the FAFSA this year. So another change is what's called family size now, or number in family. This used to be called household size, and this is can be a big determinant of a student's eligibility for Pell Grant and federal aid, and overall how their student aid index or ability to pay is calculated. So going forward, family size will be determined by default by the dependents claimed on tax returns in that prior year. So for our 24-25 FAFSA, it would be the number of dependents claimed in the 2022 taxes for the parent that is sharing that tax return, right? That is consented for that tax return. But as we know, the family size in 2022 return might not be the same as family size at the time of application. And what complicates this a little bit is that family size that's provided from the tax return is considered federal tax information and is not displayed. To give you a screenshot from the new FAFSA, you can see here, the question simply is the parent's family size different from the number of independents claimed on 2022 tax return? Doesn't give us that family size. So the family would either have to have their 22 tax return to validate this and say, no, it's not different, or they can choose yes. And if they choose yes, they have the ability to enter their own family size. This is similar to the current process where it will automatically include the parents on the FAFSA and the student, and then that parent would include additional dependents or their children that will receive greater than half support from that parent in this academic year the student is applying for aid. As I've been to many college access conferences, it is highly recommended that every contributor, every time a parent comes to this question as a contributor, they say yes, their family size is different, and to enter their own family size, because there could be multiple reasons why the tax return is going to be different than the family size that is actually true to that family size at time of application. It can be difficult to access tax returns. Part of FAFSA simplification was to not need the tax returns or to read tax returns. We have the case again in divorced parents who alternate the children claimed on taxes based off of their legal agreements. And so if that custodial parent transfers their tax returns and isn't claiming children that year, it might not be reflective of their family size. And then certainly we support a lot of students that live in multi-generational households. So we have relatives, could be older parents that live in the home and receive greater than 50% support, but aren't qualified to be claimed on a tax return. But we would want to include them in the household so that the FAFSA does accurately reflect the number living at home. So as we're thinking about advising families, really helping students understand the qualifications to be an independent student or to apply for federal aid without their parents, both the upfront qualifications, but now this new ability to claim unusual circumstances. And there was still an additional component, which is a student's status as homeless or at risk of being homeless, that would qualify them potentially as independent, which I didn't cover today. Guidance on how to determine financial support, particularly for those students, of course, that need to elect for a custodial parent, and insurance that custodial parent determination is not verified by financial aid administrators. So this is up, again, to the student, the parent, to determine what constitutes financial support, and ultimately who is the custodial parent that participates on the FAFSA. And again, I would say encouraging families to proactively input number and family to ensure accuracy in that count and how that count will be used to determine their eligibility. So that turns us now to the new eligibility rules and how family size does play a role in that. As I mentioned, the student aid index is a calculated ability to pay. And now there's a 3-step process by which a student may be eligible for a Pell Grant. So a student can be offered the maximum Pell Grant through the FAFSA. And this is now based off a parent income, or specifically AGI, as a multiple of the poverty line of their family size. If they don't qualify for the maximum Pell Grant, they may still get what's called a calculated Pell Grant based on how their student index is calculated. And ultimately, they still can be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant, again, based on AGI and family size relative to the poverty line. So what are these new qualifications? And this is a big part and a heart of FAFSA simplification, because a student may qualify for the maximum Pell Grant simply based off of their, in the case of a dependent student, their parents' marital status, family size, and their income in 2022. So this is actually a chart. I actually developed a chart like this for Miami-Dade Public Schools so that their counselors can hand out to really encourage students to understand how valuable the FAFSA can be depending on, and how to simply understand their qualification for maximum Pell. So as an example, if we're a single mom or dad for that matter, and there are 4 total in the family, so it's dad and 3 kids, or it could be dad, 2 kids, and an elderly parent. So our family size is 4. If I earn less than $62,000, or $62,438 actually, or equal to that, then my student would be eligible for the maximum Pell Grant. And it's pretty much that simple. That is the heart of simplification. There's no consideration of assets or other factors. This is the simplification and the qualification for maximum Pell. So students who meet these criteria based on their dependent students, that is, based on their parents' AGI and family size and marital status, will receive a maximum Pell Grant. This is the maximum Pell for this year, 23-24. They will be assigned an automatic 0 SAI, but they could have an SAI equal to negative 1,500, depending on the full calculation. So if the parents are earning significantly less than that AGI, that could qualify students to be seen as having more need through the calculation of a negative 1,500 student aid index. Now, if a parent is not required to file taxes because of the fact that their income falls below the threshold that they would be required to file federal taxes as a U.S. citizen or Social Security number holder, then they get an automatic negative 1,500 SAI as well. So again, there's a great opportunity to work and to have students understand these new qualifications there. One thing I'll mention about the negative 1,500 student aid index is that doesn't mean that students can get even additional Pell Grant money or that they can get aid that's greater than their cost of attendance. But this is meant to help colleges identify those students that may have even greater needs. So if they have additional institutional aid to give to those students, they're able to allocate it that way. Now, in the case that a student's not qualified for the maximum Pell Grant based just off of income, family size, and their parent marital status, then the student aid index is calculated on the back end. That information is collected. And based on their student aid index, if it's lower than the maximum Pell Grant, then they will still get a Pell Grant, but it'll be the difference between the maximum Pell in that year and the student aid index or their ability to pay that's been calculated by the FAFSA. So this is a different system to award partial Pels, and this is the new system. So again, as a student submits the FAFSA, and the other contributor, their parent submits the FAFSA and it's fully processed, the student will now receive what's called a FAFSA submission summary, which will tell them what their calculated student aid index is and what estimated federal aid they are eligible for, which would include that Pell Grant amount. Now, if a student's student aid index is greater than the maximum Pell, there's still opportunity to receive the minimum Pell, which is considered 10% of the maximum, or it is 10% of the maximum. And so again, we go back to a chart. So again, regardless of what the student aid index is calculated at, let's say it's calculated at $10,000. If that single dad with 4 in the family, that student's dad earns less than $90,188, even though their student aid index has been calculated to be 10,000, which is above the maximum Pell, they're going to receive that minimum Pell Grant, which is 10% of the Pell Grant. So these are kind of important changes. And again, at the heart of simplification. So as we advise families, we can start getting these Pell Grant charts in front of them. We can start to help them understand their potential eligibility for the maximum Pell Grant, helping them be aware of these AGI thresholds earlier for potential income planning, because if their AGI is below a certain level, they will be more eligible and can be eligible for the maximum Pell. Now, one of the things to remember and to help advise students is to know that they can qualify for the maximum Pell if they have a basis for appeal, even when their AGI is initially, or what's transferred into the FAFSA is above that initial threshold. So remembering that financial aid administrators have the ability through professional judgment to adjust AGI. Let's say a family has a hardship, extraordinary medical bills in a given year. They may have a natural disaster. You can help the student appeal through the financial aid administrator by submitting this information. And in that process, the financial aid administrator may adjust the AGI if warranted below the threshold, making that student eligible for the maximum Pell. Okay, I want to talk through some changes as well in terms of what's required on the FAFSA when it comes to eligibility. And then we'll wrap up with a review of some of the differences with number and family that impact student aid index. And then I'm happy to take questions, as many questions as we can before the top of the hour. So changes, as I mentioned, all income that is counted in the FAFSA now comes from your tax returns, and that transfer happens on the back end. We said there is no manual entry. So there were a lot of untaxed income items that used to be reported that will no longer be reported, which is fantastic because it helps reduce the complexity. So parents having to look at their W-2s for pre-tax contribution to retirement plans. All of these types of untaxed income that used to have to be figured out and reported on the FAFSA are now going away. So parents don't have to report that. It's going to rely on your tax return. Again, we want to encourage families to file early so that that return is there and it's easy enough. We're still going to need to provide manual guidance for manual entry, and that will be important. And ultimately, thinking about prior year awareness of what their income could be for that income planning. So parent assets, here's some significant changes in parent assets. So one is that since we're no longer reporting untaxed income, and child support received from an ex is a form of untaxed income, it's now going to be reported as an asset. But the rules are you don't report child support received in the same year that you're necessarily reporting your taxes on, which is 2022. It's child support received in the calendar year prior to application submission. So as an example, this year, with FAFSA opening effectively in January, you wouldn't report child support received in 2022, which is the tax year that's being used for income. You're going to report child support received in 2023, which is the calendar year prior to application submission. Net worth of business, a farm of any size is now reported. That's a change. There used to be an allowance to exclude net worth of a business or farm if that business or farm employed less than 100 full-time employees. Now, a business or farm of any size, that net worth has to be reported. And as we're reporting net worth of parent investments, there is a positive change where if we're a parent or we have parents that have saved for multiple students in multiple 529 plans, Going forward, you only report the value of the plan where the student applicant is the beneficiary of. So this is actual screenshot from the new FAFSA. We can see new is annual child support received, and there is some instruction to put that amount for the last complete calendar year. And then we have checking savings. That's the same, reporting those account balances at time of filing, reporting balances of net worth of investments, including real estate, but never to include a primary home. And then not necessarily new, the field was there, but the requirement that a business of any size needs to be, net value needs to be reported. Now, there are some certain exemptions where a parent will not have to report their assets. So the first one we discussed a little bit. So if the parent qualifies for that maximum Pell Grant based off of those AGI tables, then that's kind of the short path to a zero SAI, maximum Pell, and no need to report assets. The other scenario, if a parent earns less than $60,000, so they may not qualify for the maximum Pell, but they have their AGI in 2022 was less than $60,000, and they do not file several additional schedules. So you can see the schedules. So as soon as a parent may file one of these additional schedules, even though their AGI is less than $60,000, they will have to report assets. And for many of our small business owners, you can see they may file a Schedule C. This is getting a little weeds in the taxes. Schedule C is one of the dominant business forms. That's a schedule accompanying the 1040 when we have a business owner. So that business owner can't have a gain or a loss greater than 10,000, because if they do, then they can't qualify for that exemption for reporting assets. The third possibility is if anyone in the family receives means tested federal benefits. And this is, again, a screenshot from the new FAFSA. You can see here in 22 or 23, did the parent or anyone in their family receive any of the benefits for the following federal programs? If a parent or the parent can respond and check any one of these for either year, that would qualify them to not have to report assets. So, some challenges we might face as we're helping families is confusion on how to support, to report child support, what that means. A lot of families are going to come with questions about how do they determine the net worth of their small businesses. And as I've talked to families individually and done workshops, many times if a parent runs a service business, let's say they're a psychologist or a consultant or an accountant, they may not have calculated value, because FAFSA guidance in terms of net worth of a business or farm is to include tangible assets, let's say real estate, office space, equipment, minus any debt against that. So again, that is something that is a responsibility of the parent to figure out on how to report this, but our guidance can help them in terms of understanding what that qualification looks like. I will talk about, there are no changes to student assets reported. They're going to be the same categories of assets. I don't have time to review those, but one change in student income is that similar to the parent income, it will be based only off taxed income. Now, as we said, many students don't file tax returns, so the questions they'll be answering will be purely based off of that income that would have been taxed. Things like what they're earning on their job, or what they might have earned if they have a savings account in interest, et cetera. But the great thing is there is an increase in the amount they can earn before they're considered, that income is considered to impact or contribute to the student aid index. So students can now earn up to $9,410 without it impacting negatively their student aid impacts or increasing their student aid index. Of course, there's exclusion for federal work studies and scholarships. And because untaxed income is no longer reported, a big change is that there used to be a question asking students to report any gifts or money received by relatives outside of their immediate family. And that is no longer going to be required to be reported. It's not reported anywhere. So outside gifts from relatives are no longer reported. And there has been concerns in the past if we have the ability to, if we have generous relatives that have saved in 529 plans, what does it mean to take money from that 529 plans as untaxed income? That eliminates that concern as of now. So finally, I want to wrap up. I know we're getting to the end of time in terms of number in college and what this impact is going to look like. So the old EFC formula, or expected family contribution formula, would have a calculation, let's say at a family level, of that ability to pay. Overall calculation is $20,000, but with multiple students in college, that calculation would be divided by the number in college. So as this example shows, if this family has 2 in college and was expected to be able to pay overall for college $20,000, that expected family contribution per student goes down to 10, which increases each student's eligibility, as you can see. Here, the student aid index is different. There is no longer any allowance for a number in college in the calculation. So if the family is calculated to be able to pay for college $20,000, they are calculated to pay that per student now. So there's no longer that allowance. What I will let you know is that this question remains on the FAFSA. So this is a screenshot from the current FAFSA. You can see here between 24 and 25, how many of the parents' families will be in college, not including the parent. So this information will still be passed to colleges, but will not be used in the calculation of the ability to pay, the student aid index, or eligibility. And there is definitely, and there's been documented some implications for the elimination of what may be known as a sibling discount. Apologize, I don't have the count here, but this is a family of 4, so a married couple with 2 in college at the same time. You can see at different income levels, associated assets. I used the calculator that I built to run both ESC and student aid index. You can see the changes here. So per student with 2 in college, prior a family earning 100,000 with about 100,000 of assets would be expected to contribute per student just over 10,000. That now rises to nearly 19,000 per student. And you can see the corresponding changes and how this can impact eligibility. So it is something to be aware of. I know there was a question that came in around CSS profile and how their formula may change. And in fact, the CSS profile has released as of this Sunday, and they're going to be using the same general formula, which does include an allowance for the number in college. So I've run the numbers again, the same family of 2, with 2 in college reporting these same numbers. And you could see the difference between the 2024-25 student aid index as calculated by FAFSA versus what may be calculated by a CSS profile college. And I use the College Board's calculator to get to these numbers. So there may be a consideration as we're advising students, particularly students that may have need or high need, in terms of CSS profile colleges being a little bit more generous. Now, as I mentioned, colleges are still collecting that information. So as we're advising families, we may think about college selection in terms of need families with multiple in college. Our CSS profile is going to be slightly more favorable. Of course, we have net price calculators that we can use to help with that. There may be individual college outreach for institutional aid. And why I say that is that because colleges that only require the FAFSA will still have the number in college, will they use that in some way to determine how to distribute their institutional aid? They can't change that formula and change the federal student aid index that's calculated but based on number in college, but they can adopt that and change that a bit for their own institutional consideration. But I will say, as I've been to the NASFA conference, which is the National Association of Financial Aid Administrators, and other conferences, there was a lot of talk about, well, how can a financial aid administrator use professional judgment, again, that process of appeals, to consider a sibling's college expenses in as a hardship, if you want to say, or as a special circumstances to adjust that the student's student aid index and eligibility. And the answer is, from the Department of Education, federal student aid, is this can be an allowable reason to use professional judgment. So what might this look like? We kind of don't know right now. But what this could look like is at a college that only uses FAFSA and is using the federal student aid index, if a parent or student were to submit expenses for their siblings' college expenses, that financial aid administrator may offset AGI, in other words, lower AGI, by the expense amount in order to recalculate the federal student aid index. So while they can't change the formula and divide a number by the number in college, they can make adjustments to specific data elements within the FAFSA, particularly AGI, that can impact eligibility. So quick timeline for this fall. I've been pushing these things slowly to the right. The FAFSA estimator was live for a while. It was reported to not be working accurately. So as I haven't checked it recently, but the federal government took it back down. We hope it's going to be back up. I do have a FAFSA student aid index calculator on my website. The federal student aid ID process and for non-Social Security number holders was supposed to be originally released in September. Now we're hoping it'll be sometime toward the end of October, but we don't have an exact date there. There's going to be additional FSA trainings on the new FAFSA. And then as best as we know, and most financial aid administrators are coming to a consensus that legislatively, that FAFSA does have to release by January 1st. So we are thinking that FAFSA will go live as late as New Year's Eve, 11:59 p.m. The demo will be released just prior to that so that they can meet their deadline, and FAFSA submission dates will have now been moved almost by every college categorically into January, February timeframe. If you want to access more resources, I've created a counselor resource center for the new FAFSA that will allow you to go through, as one of the things I did is very specific topics here in terms of new requirements on federal student aid ID, federal tax information sharing, et cetera. The Department of Education did do a walkthrough of the FAFSA. I recorded that and have that if you'd want to look at that. And I'm also going to add, very gratefully, very recently, they have done a demo site. So this is not a live demo of the FAFSA, but these are different screens of the FAFSA that you can walk through using different scenarios as a student, a parent, et cetera, just to get an idea of what the FAFSA will look like. And as part of the resource center as well, I've done a crosswalk, which you can download, which will show you the process changes, old and new, terminology changes, as well as eligibility changes. And these do have links to those specific articles that I wrote in terms of what these new rules look like. So I hope that's helpful. I know this was a bit of a long presentation, but I wanted to answer as many questions proactively as we were getting a lot of questions prior to our webinar, and I'm happy to answer additional questions in the remaining less than 10 minutes we have.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. That was such incredible information. And we do have some questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to shoot those off and get those answered as soon as possible. So one of the question is, what happens if a student gets it wrong? So what is some advice that you have for counselors to help students with that?
Yes. Well, as we have in every other year, students will be able to go back and correct their FAFSA. So, if we are reviewing the FAFSA with the student and we see that there may be incorrect information, we can help guide them in terms of that providing that correct information. The other thing that's been reassured by federal student aid is that if a contributor, either the student or the parent, declines consent, they are able to go back and provide that consent later. So let's say a student has a parent who didn't consent, has filled out the rest of the FAFSA manually. Ultimately, financial administrator is going to come back to the student and say, hey, we're missing consent. We can't process your FAFSA. That will allow that student to have their parent go back and provide consent. But I do want to emphasize that as we have different roles on FAFSA now, those contributors will control their sections of the FAFSA. So the student can't go in to that parent's FAFSA section and provide consent. That parent has to log in with their federal student aid ID that is identity verified to provide that consent.
Awesome. That leads right into the next one. So do both parents have to create an FSA ID even if they file taxes jointly as a married couple?
Yeah, and I know it can be confusing. So as long as the parents file jointly, that allows only one parent to create an FSA ID because that parent has the right to consent for the IRS to share that joint tax return as one of the the persons who submitted the tax returns into the FAFSA and complete all the parent asset questions. So it is still the case if parents are married, only one parent has to create an FSA ID to participate. If parents are married and filing jointly specifically. In the case that parents don't, and I have worked with many students whose one parent files head of household, the other parent doesn't file or files potentially a different way. In those cases, or they file married and filing separately, then both parents have to create separate FSA IDs. Both parents have to consent for sharing that information from the IRS.
And what advice do you have if a student doesn't have contact with their parents, one or both?
So that may be the case as you're working with the student individually to review either through the demo site and to read some of the up on what federal student aid is now guiding students to choose with an unusual circumstance. That sounds like it may be an unusual circumstance that will allow a student to check that box, complete that application by themselves as a provisionally independent student, but helping them understand what kind of documentation a financial aid administrator is going to need to substantiate that non-contact. And it may be even helpful for the student prior to completing the FAFSA. They have certain target schools to talk to financial aid administrator at a college to understand what that process will look like and what expected documentation is. I do know in working within the financial aid community, many of these financial aid officers want to talk to prospective students as well, support them, and help them understand how to be successful in the process.
Awesome. And what advice do you have for counselors wanting to reassure a parent who does not have a social security number that creating a profile will not flag immigration?
Yes. I will say it's going to be hard. And I would say that we need to be sensitive to the need of that parent and their confidentiality and their status. And so our best next step might be to encourage them to submit a paper FAFSA. I would say, we talked a lot about this at Miami-Dade Public Schools in our workshops. We don't want parents to take action that make them feel at jeopardy or feel less at ease, given our current climate in many states or nationally. So I would say our recommended path is not to push that creation, but potentially to submit the paper FAFSA, which will allow them to be fully processed equally through a wet signature or a hard signature.
Awesome. And is there a separate application for an appeal? So if they get their SAI and they want to appeal it?
Excellent question. So the new FAFSA simplification law also now requires every college to have a well-documented appeals process on their financial aid website. So the appeal will happen at an individual college level, and each college will determine what the appeals process is, what specific forms they might need, and what, candidly, oftentimes they'll list very clearly what they will consider in an appeals process, like what circumstances they will generally consider. So that is the best way, is to have the student go directly to the financial aid website. Typically, I just type in college name, financial aid appeal. It's usually the first link. Or if they're currently in college or have contact with a financial aid officer, to have them talk to them directly or email them for what that process looks like.
Awesome. I think we can probably do about 2 more questions.
Okay.
The next one is, do we still take into account prior year taxes for this FAFSA?
Correct. Yeah. So I apologize I didn't make that extra clear, but for 24-25 FAFSA, even though it will open in January, we know some students may not complete until February, March, April, when their 2023 taxes may be filed by their parents. It will still be based, even with the delay, on 2022 tax returns. It's still prior year.
Awesome. And then can a step parent be the person that provides the majority of the financial support?
So no. So the rules are, it's either the one of the biological or adoptive parents that provide the greater financial support. And that I might assume that's the original adoptive parent, where we have a student that was adopted and then have now divorced a parent. So that the only reason, the reason why a spouse would participate or a step parent is because that their spouse, which is the student's parent, biological parent, is considered the custodial parent. And in that case, that new spouse would participate on the FAFSA, but that new spouse in and of themselves, or the step parent, would not be considered one of the parents. That would be the custodial parent.
I'm going to throw one more question in here.
Right.
So when it comes to financial aid eligibility, if the Pell amount is based on AGI, what does the student aid index impact? State and institutional aid?
So great question. Yes. So the student aid index could impact Pell, because if they don't get the maximum Pell, but their student aid index is less than the maximum Pell, they can still get a Pell grant. So there's still Pell eligibility there. It could impact federal aid, like whether they get a subsidized loan or unsubsidized loan, work study. And then yes, then ultimately it could highly impact the amount of institutional aid they're going to be offered, or potentially state aid, depending on how the state calculates their aid as well.
Right, awesome. So we just came to the top of the hour. Want to say thank you once again to Paul. Thank you for sharing all of this. As a reminder to everyone on the call, the recording will be sent out, and we'll be sure to include some of the links that Paul has already mentioned. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the great questions, and everyone have a great afternoon or evening wherever you are in the world.
Good afternoon, everyone. Take care. Thanks for the invite.